Okay, so we're your dessert, so you can keep on eating while we talk, and then after we're done, actually after you're done, we'll have a chance to have questions and answers with our distinguished panel. But before I introduce our panel, and I will not go through their extensive bios because you have all the material at your seats, I do want to recognize two people here. First, I want to reacquaint you again with Tom McDonnell. He understated his role, actually, before coming to Kauffman. He was a founder of DST and grew it to an enormous size that it is today over the course of his career. And so Kauffman could not be better served than being headed now by one of Kansas City's most successful entrepreneurs. And you will see him in many future years here in Washington, D.C. So let's all welcome Tom. And the second person I want to recognize is a colleague that I worked with at Kauffman for many years, who is the prime author of the report that you see and is now Director of Entrepreneurship at the Foundation. Many of you know who he is, Dane Stangler. Okay, so now we're going to turn to our panel, and this is all going to be very informal. I'm going to throw out some questions to various people, and they're going to chime in. And you guys just, as I said, just interrupt each other and hopefully respond to the questions that I pose before we go to Q&A. So we have Chance Barnett here, who is co-founder and CEO of Crowdfunder. So it won't be a surprise what I'm going to ask him about. We have Jeff Fagnan, who is the partner of Atlas Venture over there. Very much a seed investor, and it won't be a surprise what I'm going to ask him about. Donna Harris, who is the managing director of Startup Regions for Startup America Partnership, and Ramana Nanda at the Harvard Business School, one of the leading academic experts on entrepreneurial finance. And last but not least, we're privileged to have Alan Patricof here, the founder and also the managing director of Greycroft Partners, one of the leading VC firms in the country. So I want to begin sort of where Senator Moran and Tom left off, which is to talk about the state of entrepreneurship as it is now. Both of them cited statistics from both the BLS and also from Kauffman to the effect that since the recession until 2010, which is the latest year for which we have data, the rate of, or actually the number of new firms being started every year has fallen precipitously, from roughly 600,000 to about 400,000. We don't have data yet, though, for 2011 and 2012. So the first question I want to ask, and maybe I'll start with Donna, and that is, we don't know the data, but do you have a sense out there of the pulse of the country? Are we seeing a pickup in entrepreneurial activity?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Are
you on? Oh, good.
There, how's that? So I'm glad that you pointed out the year of the data, because the question is whether we're looking in the rearview mirror or we're looking out the dashboard as we look forward. So the last year and a half, I've spent traveling the country with Startup America, mobilizing the Startup America regions, and there's a couple of takeaways that I think really bode well for the future of entrepreneurship and some of the data that I hope we'll see coming out in the coming years. First of all, if you are a Startup America champion that has come to join us from across the country today, will you stand up?
Wow. Woo.
Great. All right, so these are...
That tells you something, doesn't it?
These are successful entrepreneurs who are volunteering on their own dime, in their own time, to make their communities stronger. And they're here today to showcase for the White House and administration officials the things that they're doing in their communities to make them stronger. So the energy, the enthusiasm, the caliber of the individuals that are saying, no more am I going to hear about my community not as a great place for startups. So they're literally crafting huge plans for what their communities can become, and they're tackling things like access to capital. How do we unlock the wealth in our communities? How do we get more celebration and spotlight on our startups? Because often a lot of this has to do with the fact that people don't realize there are startups everywhere. We only really tell the stories about Silicon Valley and New York and Boston. If you think of the column inches that those cities take up versus the attention that a place like Iowa gets, or Virginia gets, or Maryland gets, or Tennessee gets. It's a dramatic difference. So their communities are not only doing substantive things to tackle their challenges, but they're also being purposeful about, if our community were a startup, what would we do to make it the best startup ever? So it's literally some basic blocking and tackling, value proposition, big idea, what's our unique assets, and how do we leverage that to bring the whole community together? And frankly, how do we market ourselves better? Because some of the best companies that you know of, brand names, they're not based in Silicon Valley. They're actually based in unexpected places like Phoenix, Arizona, and Baltimore, Maryland. So I actually think that the energy that we see and the volunteerism and the give before getting philosophy is really resonating, and I think will set the trend for what happens with the data when we look 2 years, 3 years from now.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to Alan Patricof in a minute because he has to leave, unfortunately, early for a plane. But before, Alan, I ask you a question, I do want to give a commercial for something that Kauffman has done and is going to be spread around the country. It's a program called 1 Million Cups that actually started right before I left the foundation over the summer. And it's where entrepreneurs basically form networks with each other, and they do pitches with each other, and they get help from each other. And this program, when I first saw it, and it's headed by Tom Rue, who is here. Where are you, Tom? He's right here. This program, only 7 or 8 months ago, attracted maybe 10 or 12 people a week in Kansas City. It's now up to 250 people a week. And it is spreading throughout the country. So at least there is a small example of something that's going on in the country that maybe our statistics haven't captured yet, which is a nice lead into Alan. We talked before this panel. You have some thoughts about maybe the green shoots of entrepreneurship going on around the country.
Well, I'm glad that I was preceded by Donna, because I agree with her 110%. And I was having a debate just before we started with my friend Steve Case, who I'm sure you all know, and Karen Mills about this, do we have a lot of startup activity or don't we? The statistics seem to keep saying we don't. But I will tell you, I can just judge by the number of invitations I get to speak on panels around the country and where they come from. And I will tell you that, in my opinion, the entrepreneurial bug has hit this country. And maybe it's because your statistics are out of date. Not out of date, they're just 2 years, so I don't want to say out of date. You can't get statistics up to the minute.
Right.
But I have been in this business of backing young companies for 44 years. I shouldn't admit to that, but that's the truth. And I have never seen activity like I've seen in the last 24, 36 months. And it's not just New York, San Francisco, and Boston. I think a good example is when I opened my Act 2, which was 6 years ago, and I started Greycroft after having built one of the biggest private equity firms. It started as venture, became private equity. I went back and started venture capital all over again with small investments, young companies. I opened in New York and Los Angeles, and people thought I was crazy being in Los Angeles because, it's big for the movie industry, but there's no venture capital in Los Angeles, and of course you can imagine the territorial debates between San Francisco and Silicon Valley and Los Angeles. Los Angeles is burning hot at the moment. There are more startups. There are more incubators. We've had 3 or 4 incubators started in the last 12 months. We've been involved with one of them. I know New York, sounds like it's a major city, but 5 years ago you couldn't get anybody to go to New York. It was Boston and San Francisco. And I will tell you, tonight I'm going to the New York Tech meetup, which will have 1,000 people, 1,000 entrepreneurs, scientists, engineers, standing room only to get in to talk about tech startups that are going on. Now, the problem we may have, and we do have probably, is there is a bifurcation. I mean, I was, in 1992 or 3, I was chairman of the White House Conference and Small Business Commission, and we had 25,000 people attending from all over the country. It was mostly small, really small businesses, and I think that's where we have to understand the bifurcation. Technology companies, companies that have high growth plans, that are being founded by people perhaps that came out of engineering school, business school, they are on fire. It's the basic businesses that I think Karen was talking about that are probably having the trouble access to capital. And the other problem is there is a greater attention, which everybody wants, on technology. So manufacturing businesses have I would say, a bigger neglect, a neglect that we have to be concerned with. And by their nature, they're capital intensive. Technology businesses, because of all the new technologies coming in and outsourcing and cheap spectrum, cloud computing, the cost of getting into a technology business is dramatically less than what it was when we were involved with America Online 20, no, it's 30 years now, 30 years ago. Years go too fast. So I think technology is hot. I get asked to speak at business schools all over the place. I was at Wharton just yesterday. An enormous proportion of the people who graduate, when you ask them how many are going to start their own business, raise their hands. So it's happening, and it's happening in Kansas City, it's happening in Ames, Iowa, and it's happening all over this country. And I think part of it is Startup America. I think Startup America, the Jobs Act, the whole crowdfunding concept is getting people aware of the fact that they can be, and I want to say one more thing, that they can participate in the venture capital world. We had a hot stock market in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and everybody was participating in the market. I had this theory that they were all people who wanted to be venture capitalists, and they couldn't do it in the private funds like mine, so they would buy it in the stock market. I think what we're having today is because of all these new technologies, AngelList, and all these other sources, is that people are getting an opportunity to put money behind someone they believe is smart and has or a good idea that they like. And that angels are a major factor in financing today. 20 years ago, if we saw a deal that had angels in it, we would probably avoid it. Today, we're so enthusiastic when we know the startup has taken place with angel funding, because it means usually there are smart people around who are giving mentorship, and mentorship is critical to these early stage companies. I'll turn it over.
Okay, terrific. So now you've given a perfect segue to what I want to ask next. I'm going to ask Jeff to weigh in, and that's about entrepreneurial finance, specifically VC money, angel. Let's hold off on crowdfunding, because I want to give a chance to talk about crowdfunding. But so the conventional wisdom is that after the bursting of the internet bubble in 2000, VCs all got risk averse, and they just basically didn't do seed stage stuff. And so what I want to ask you now is, I mean, Alan's basically sort of laid the predicate for this. He thinks a lot of seed stage money is coming back. And why don't you tell us if that's true, and if so, how, and also tell people about what AngelList is.
Sure. So first off, I think it's true. I think that after you had the bust in 2000, I think venture capital did a disservice to entrepreneurship. I think it was at a point in time where so many people pulled back and pulled the reins of funding. And I actually think that we went through a dark ages, of 2000 to 2007, where, look, there was no shortage of innovation. There was still 5,000 computer science graduates coming out of MIT and Harvard up, and there was just no innovative capital that was willing to take those types of risks. And I think you had that with, kind of a generation of some older general partners and some older firms. And unfortunately, I think in some regions, especially in the region that I'm familiar with in New England, it changed a lot. I do think, just to answer the first question, entrepreneurship is back on a roll. And I think there's a reemergence of it, there's a reemergence of innovation, and there's a reemergence of connectivity. I firmly believe that Mark Zuckerberg's greatest contribution is going to be that he is engendering a whole new generation of entrepreneurs. I talk at Harvard, everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. Before, people wanted to be investment bankers and they wanted to be consultants. This has changed, and this is good. Now comes in, how do you fund all of these upstarts? And Alan's right again. We did a study last year. We think that for $1 million, you can get done what took $10 million 7 or 8 years ago. And it's because of all this. So now enter the paradigm on there's a lot of people that can provide a small amount of capital, and if a company works, it can hit a stratosphere fairly quickly. And so what you see is you see a lot of serial entrepreneurs coming back as angels. And I do think they're coming back because they want to make some money, but they're also coming back because they realize that somebody else gave them a shot. And this is a very much pay-it-forward mentality. And so we see that happening. And then, and some of the stats are encouraging. Things like AngelList and Kickstarter. AngelList still, and it's only a year and a half in its kind of journey, 100 companies every day apply on AngelList. $1.8 billion of funding has gone through that platform in the last 15 months. And what else it's doing is, it's already been highlighted. Too much entrepreneurship and innovation people regulate to both coasts. And I think AngelList, Crowdfunder, and other platforms are going to allow us to start to find innovation that happens, in Louisville, in Ann Arbor, in Chicago. And look, this is great because I think that the whole, previous mindset that you had to be right next to an entrepreneur to make it work, it's just bogus. And the same reason that technology works today. Some of the best entrepreneurs I work with, we text 3 or 4 times a day. We Skype at night. The whole board meeting concept of coming in and going through a 5-hour meeting, it's not needed. I know everything that's going on in that company.
Ramana, why don't you weigh in? You spent most of your academic career studying all this.
Yeah.
And what I want to ask you is are there any dark clouds that we should worry about? Or is it all just great news?
So I'll echo some of the great news before I talk about a couple of concerns.
Okay.
So I think I've been seeing exactly what the three of you have spoken about. HBS graduates are increasingly interested in going into entrepreneurship. Just to give you some statistics, we've seen more than a 50% increase in the number of graduates who start a business right out of college, out of HBS. And that's one of my colleagues had an informal poll in class where he asked people, are you interested in starting a business either right out of school or at some point in your career? And out of a class of 90, everyone except 4 said that either at graduation or at some point in their career, they had an interest in starting a new business themselves. So I think there is this real passion for entrepreneurship. It's a buzz in the air. A lot of it, in my view, seems to be geared towards consumer-facing companies, consumer internet in particular. And in terms of the dark clouds, I think one of the challenges really kind of stem on more capital-intensive industries like biotechnology, like energy. If you look at the data, for the aggregate economy, we don't have data for the last 2 years, but we do have data from the Venture Capital Association. And we see that there was this steep fall off in 2009, 2010, but it has risen to pre-2000, to 2007, 2008 levels for consumer internet companies, but it has continued to fall off for biotech companies, for energy companies, and I think that is something that we should be concerned about, try to think about how we may be able to jumpstart innovation in those segments.
Well, do you have any quick ideas on how to fix that?
Well, I was going to echo that's a significant issue, though, because in a lot of these places, the industries that are the natural assets of these communities is not consumer web. It's education, it's healthcare, it's manufacturing, it's transportation, it's bioscience. So it is a significant issue, and I think it's an important one to really have a conversation about, because unlocking capital can't just be the sexy capital that goes into consumer web. It has to be substantive patient capital to get some of these companies funded, because that's how these ecosystems will begin to generate these job-creating companies.
You guys want to weigh in on this?
I just was going to say, there is a real problem in the country, and that is for the manufacturing or heavy capital-intensive businesses. And I think it would serve the Kauffman Foundation well, it would serve the country well in terms of all the efforts being done now, is to really just focus on those businesses, because the venture capital community, the angel community, is just not responding, and for pretty good reasons. You have to understand, the public markets have virtually disappeared for companies today. When I started my new fund, I started with a $75 million fund. The previous fund I had run was 11 billion euros. So you get the difference in dimension. And the reason is because take advantage of the capital efficiency that we saw. So we are going into businesses with small amounts of money that take small follow-on capital. The ones that are capital intensive, biotech, energy, and basic manufacturing, the venture industry is not serving. I don't think there's too much angel interest in, and there's where we need to come up with some new techniques, new financial incentives. We desperately need that if we want to maintain or increase our manufacturing base. There are almost, I mean, this is really heretical to say this, but I've said it several places publicly lately. We almost have too many startups in the technology world right now. And a lot of them are imitative. During a week, I may see 20, 30, 40 deals, and half of them are repeating something else that's out there already, and it's just another version of the same thing. We need people with more innovative ideas that are differentiated, and so a lot of them are capital intensive, and I think we have to find a way to solve that problem.
Did you want to weigh in, Jeff?
Yeah, I would weigh in a bit. I think that in all sectors, I think there's ways to be more capital efficient. We see it today a lot in biotech. I think that one of the banes of biotech is, you try to reproduce things that actually can't be reproduced, and you start to scale a bunch of things that actually your most natural buyer, which is pharma, they don't really care about. They care about clinical momentum. And so I think that we're trying to challenge the paradigm on the biotherapeutic and the biotech side. I think same thing. Look at companies of robotics. In Boston is a very kind of rich area for robotics. The cost of these endeavors used to be extreme, but off-the-shelf processors and all this stuff. But cloud computing, that's biotech too, right? And a lot of this stuff is happening. So I think in all these sectors, you have to challenge the traditional. It's a capital-intensive paradigm, and I think that's healthy because I think capital intensity in all sectors is the beta returns.
Right. Okay, so now I want to get to Chance, all right? So we're going to talk about crowdfunding, all right? And for those of you who've gotten the preview, crowdfunding was authorized in the Jobs Act. The SEC is supposed to write rules. It's already late. We're waiting for the actual proposal to come out anxiously. And so the question I want to ask you is, you think the SEC is going to let this thing rip and go? And if so, what kind of potential can we see out of crowdfunding?
So, yeah, I've spent a lot of time around the SEC. Met with them immediately after the signing of the Jobs Act and have been working towards that for obvious reasons. There were some disappointments, and what we've seen over the last 3 months is a change in leadership there with the chair. So now we have someone that we feel will be in office to lead the SEC and to actually drive forth the implementation of the regulations. So the general timeline, as we understand it, has been pushed back several times. There's already a proposal for one of the two pieces of the Jobs Act that are relative to crowdfunding. One of those is really not true crowdfunding. It allows accredited investors to be solicited to online. But if you look at that from a detached perspective and forget about what crowdfunding is, you look at that as an access to capital opportunity for entrepreneurs to get in front of accredited investors, and that's significant. And so I feel confident that will roll out prior to quote-unquote real public crowdfunding legislation earlier, and that could be pretty soon, depending on the prioritization that the new chair gives crowdfunding regulations. And then, so what we'll likely see is an implementation of that over a couple months from her being in office, Mayor Joe White. So that could look like April or May for this Title II with accredited investors, and then we'll probably look at Q3 or Q4 for implementation of non-accredited crowdfunding. That's what most people look at as the larger market for everyone to quote-unquote participate in investing. How is it going to move the needle? Is this important? I think it's really important for a lot of the reasons these guys mentioned. First of all, crowdfunding doesn't come from a bubble or a vacuum. It comes from this collaborative movement that I think has validated the idea of collaborative funding to the point where legislators took it seriously. Other entrepreneurs got involved, myself included, and helped pass legislation. So there's a lot of great people in this room who have supported and backed these ideas, and now we're about to see this birth of a new capital market. So I believe it's going to be one of the more revolutionary areas, certainly one of the most revolutionary parts of finance that we'll see in our lifetime. That being said, I believe, as you can already see, there's concerns, there's need to be cautious with how this market's put out there and how it's regulated. And so I agree with that. I want to protect investors as much as anyone. So, the real power that I think will be unlocked here is, if you're a tech startup, you can throw a rock and meet a potential angel investor or connect with an incubator. That's fantastic. But what happens if you're not that consumer technology startup person? What happens if you have a business outside of that high velocity bubble? And I think that's where the power of this collaborative model of funding, now that we're moving it into a securities world where you can invest, really unlocks the power of community. So what we're focused on, and what I think is the bigger implementation that creates great outcomes and moves the needle for small businesses across the US and ultimately across the globe, is not that people put up an offer on the web and then people who have never met, who aren't in the same ecosystem, go and try and place a bet. That's not the outcome, I think, that is highly transformative. What will be transformative is adding value and allowing people to engage who exist in an ecosystem but maybe didn't have a voice, didn't have a place to gather, and didn't have a place to find each other. And now they can find each other locally and engage. And the web is what powers that. So it's Mark Andreessen who, from the prominent Silicon Valley VC firm Andreessen Horowitz, said software is going to eat the world. And I think it's really interesting that software is slowly starting to eat finance. And it's a big, hairy, scary business. There's a lot of liability. And I think, if you look at implementation of legislation and regulations, we're actually moving relatively quickly. It's not the pace that startups are used to, but if over a 2-year period we see the passing of Jobs Act legislation and the implementation of crowdfunding, that sounds like a pretty good set of movement and success. So the other thing I'll point out is that I believe, and I'm actually have some initiatives to not just say what's the access to capital for entrepreneurs, but ultimately what's the larger economic impact of that to help employ Americans, to help stimulate our economy. So I personally believe this has a significant ability to put capital in the hands of people who will then hire locally. A dollar invested locally generally circulates several more times when invested or spent at a small business rather than spent at a large chain. So what I think we'll also see is outcomes and some focus on local investing in businesses, and thus more reinforcement of patronage in those people shopping locally because they might actually be an owner in a local business. And that will also have other great outcomes in the economy.
Okay, I want to find out, how am I doing on time with you? Okay.
10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes. You want to make a point, but I actually want to direct a question to you, right? And then you can make your point.
Yeah.
So one of the claimed advantages of crowdfunding is that it will actually help VCs because it will help you do due diligence.
I don't think that's fair.
And okay, so I wanted to ask you.
I don't agree with that. I don't think, you may have another opinion, but I think it's unrelated to our business. It's a different market. I will say that I am strongly in favor of the Jobs Act. I'm not as relaxed as you are, Chance. I'm surprised you're saying the pace is moving along. I'm frustrated with the pace. I think the Jobs Act was passed. When was it passed?
Last April.
Yeah. And it should have, and the SEC is delayed on implementation, and I know lots of people who would like to take access to it, and they keep getting frustrated and frustrated, more and frustrated by the fact that it's not, the rules have not come out, and this is not rocket science. I think there's so much concern about the harm things are going to do, that they lose sight of what the good it can do, and it will loosen up an awful lot of capital, a lot of money for financing, and sure, there are always dishonest people around who are going to get you somehow or other, but I think that the fraction of people that will be dishonest will be pale in relation to the number of honest, hardworking, well worthwhile businesses that may get started with this. And I think as part of this, a corollary of it is the public markets, which are also covered in that ruling, which are not being implemented. There are all kinds of opportunities to make it easier to be public. I like to say that people lose sight of the fact that Intel went public in 1971. I know this exactly to the penny. Went public and raised $8 million at a $25 million value for the entire company. So keep that in mind. And part of they sold 350,000 shares. And part of it was selling shareholders, believe it or not. So that whole market is totally gone away. I mean, you couldn't go public today without raising, I'll say 50, but probably it's higher than that, raising $50 to $100 million and have a market cap of $350 to $500 million and still have an active public market after you went public. It's a different world today. And that whole going public of younger companies with smaller amounts has totally gone away. So perhaps the Jobs Act, I think, is designed to help that situation by relaxing some of the regulations and also coming up with new techniques of how to finance companies in the public markets.
Ramana?
Yeah, so I guess one thing I wanted to point out, building on what Alan was saying, given the fact that the public markets have dried up, companies end up being private for a lot longer. They end up being a lot larger when they go public. And or they sell out to another company. And so the way in which common investors in the past could have made a lot of money by buying into small new public companies and actually growing with them, as one could have done with say, Intel, is not really as possible to do today as it was at that time. So I think that's one thing to think about. The other is that, in some sense, crowdfunding has existed in some incarnations already. So peer-to-peer lending is possible. It's possible to obviously give donations. Kickstarter has raised more money for the arts than the National Endowment for the Arts, which is quite a staggering statistic. And obviously, one can kind of prepay and do crowdfunding that way. The big thing that the Jobs Act allows is for people to take equity in startups. And the positive aspect of that is that they can take equity in these companies and have their value grow precisely in the way that they could have done had it gone public in the past. And the rules today essentially mean that it's only really, really wealthy people, over $1 million in net worth, excluding the home, or those with income over $200,000 who can participate in that. But I think the flip side is important to bear in mind, which is that typically these people, private investors who've invested in these kinds of companies, they take a portfolio-based approach because they have the assets to be able to invest in a number of different companies, most of which fail completely. Over 50% of venture-backed companies get terminated below their cost of the investment. They're illiquid, and they take various kinds of preferred stock and other ways to kind of make sure that their interests are protected in the event that the company goes bad. So I think some of the concerns are important to bear in mind, and I really do think that balancing the interests are really important. There's some really great positive aspects, but there's things to be kind of careful about as well. I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Also, one of the things that I didn't touch on relative to is it good for VCs, do they like it or not? What the VCs just said here, ask them. They said it. What's great for a VC is great deal flow. And what's great for a VC is knowing strong entrepreneurs and getting to build relationships and seeing if they're doing something credible and jumping in at the right time. What crowdfunding has the potential to do is to create more data, to create a series of ways to validate what you're doing. Yeah.
He had a plane, don't worry.
Exactly.
It wasn't he didn't like the conversation. Don't worry about that.
Come on, Alan, please come back. Come on.
Alan, thank you so much, by the way. Thank you.
So, point being, it has the potential to create a lot more data and a lot more points of validation that can then be transparent and not, an entrepreneur in a room pitching an investor trying to say, here's who I am. A community of people validating, here's who this person is to us, whether they're customers or the local ecosystem of mentors. There's a variety of assets that can come to bear. If you look at AngelList, you see part of their business, even though they're not getting paid for it right now, is connecting entrepreneurs to other entrepreneurs. So the importance of an ecosystem can't be understated. And Mrs. Mills also talked about the importance of that, and the SBA really understanding that. So crowdfunding has the potential to make more dense those clusters and to more highly engage people and to create data around that can help VCs make better decisions.
You got a quick word?
Well, and not to overemphasize the community point, but I would also point out that if you look at the wealth, the distribution of wealth in our country, and you overlay that to the actual investment in the local community, there's a huge disparity between the amount of wealth that exists in these communities and the amount of investment that is being put into the startup ecosystem. But yet, these wealthy individuals aren't sitting around on piles of cash. They're doing something with it. So we need a mechanism to engage them in the startup ecosystem. And in many cases, they don't know that there's an investment possible in their backyard. They don't know they can get a good ROI. They don't have access to deal flow. And they don't necessarily understand how to do a traditional angel investment. And so one of the values of crowdfunding is just the ability to use it as a tool in the arsenal in the startup community to help really engage the wealth that exists, to give them a platform and the ability to have visibility to what's happening in their own backyard in a way they don't have that today if they're not participating in traditional angel groups and other activities that are frankly meeting behind closed doors. They're not as open and transparent as they might be in some communities. I mean, there are places like Ann Arbor and others that, yeah, you can go to the coffee shop and you can see deal flow because it's walking into the coffee shop every day, having coffee and hanging out. But in other communities, it's behind the country club door. So the idea of being able to make this a tool that helps bring transparency and openness, I think it's a hugely valuable tool beyond just the point of getting investment to startups.
Okay, we have 15 minutes. I want to have a conversation. So, oh yeah, we got lots of hands. I want to get this going. Let's. Do we have a mic, or do you just want to get up and shout? All right, loud. Huh? Oh, that's right. I forgot. We're on TV. So
not loud enough for everyone looking at this through the internet. Yeah. That would be impressive indeed. Thank you, guys. I'm Alejandro Crawford, senior partner at Acceleration Group. You have focused a lot in your comments on the groundswell of passionate entrepreneurship, folks showing up to events, investors wanting to invest cash, et cetera. I work both with the entrepreneur trying to raise money and with investors trying to make better bets. And in that work, I have found time and time again that folks have a paucity of good tools for dealing with change. And I mean change in business models, technologies, markets, user behavior. I think that both the entrepreneur and the investor are stuck between the traditional business plan, which is an exercise in imagination about what might happen 5 years out, and the injunction to pivot, as if you're on a basketball court and you just turn, right? What I want to ask you guys is the degree to which you, in your experience, and Kauffman Foundation in its research, are looking into better preparing both the entrepreneur and the investor to look at emerging opportunities, to look at changing risks deriving from markets and technologies and the like, and better equip the entrepreneur and the small investor to see what's changing and manage those risks as those changes occur. So can we get beyond the business plan and the pivot? That's the question. Thank you.
Okay, anybody here? By the way, even though I don't work at Kauffman anymore, I know what the Kauffman answer is. And the Kauffman answer is, yes, they are working hard to answer your question. But in any event, who else wants to do this?
Yeah, so I think it's a great point. I happen to think that the business plan is outdated. I think that market validation is not outdated, but the business plan with 5 years of forecasted financials, terrible. I actually was on record last year saying that I've never actually funded a startup that had a business plan. True. Absolutely true. Give me 7 slides. Tell me what you're doing. Tell me about why your background. Tell me why you're a domain expert. Tell me about the tectonic shifts that's happening. That's what I'm interested in. You can show me, this hockey stick here with revenues. Doesn't do anything. You tell me about a supply chain that you're going to run in year 7. I don't care. I'm interested in the next 6 months. Startups move so fast, and right now, most of the companies that I'm involved with, we don't even do annual planning. We do 4-month planning because that's how fast things change. So yeah, I think there are things that are happening, and I actually think that some of these online platforms enable that. we can't be experts in every single space. So, a year ago we invested in a point of sale, type of solution that goes out in restaurants, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to mine point of sale data in restaurants to actually rank servers, force rank servers based on check size. And the whole concept is that actually if you can measure that, you can then do something about getting better behavior and restaurants get better top line. We thought that was really innovative. We went on AngelList and we said, who knows about point of sale? Who knows about restaurants? And all these people that were involved in Open Table, all these people that were involved in point of sale when that whole distribution kind of came about, we would have never got to these people without some sort of online tools. And the entrepreneur that we were backing would have never got to them as well. So I think some of this is happening, but completely agree. I think that I was on the board of the MIT 100K business plan competition for a lot of years and said, I will not come back until you abolish the fact that it's a business plan. Because you're forcing people to do things instead of getting real customer feedback, real market feedback. And writing a business plan in a vacuum, completely worthless.
Okay, let's let that answer suffice because I want to get some more questions. So we had, there was somebody here, although you've got, okay, there's somebody back there with the mic.
My name is Eileen Miller, and I'm the co-founder of a local startup called ActivityRocket.com. And the question I have for you today is, we bootstrapped. We then went out and did a friends and family and angel raise that will last us hopefully through the end of this year. Crowdfunding is something that we would consider to enable us to essentially penetrate the local market. But my question is, if we do crowdfunding as sort of the next step on our goal towards nationalizing and scaling our business, will that compromise our ability to raise venture capital? What would the venture capital's perception of crowdfunding be? We were told, and I think some of the speakers made this point today, that they want to see angel investors invest in our company as well as friends and family to help validate the concept. And another point was made that using the crowdfunding will also validate the concept, but will the venture capital follow the crowdfunding if we go that route?
Chance?
Well, I'll let a VC answer for himself, but I'll say this. There are VCs who say, I absolutely won't invest in a crowdfunding company, although they've never seen a term sheet for one, so it's absolutely a straw man argument, and I'd love to see them get special access to taking a deal that has tons of traction and wild amount of customers that love the company and have them say no on principle, then I'll believe them. That being said, there's legitimate concerns about some of the problems that creates. And there's ways to look at this. So you're not forced to offer $100 to any investor who wants in. What the platforms will offer, what I think is a better outcome is to guide you towards making an offering that doesn't have 500 investors in it. That's not because they could all be problems. They could be. You could have people that you don't know that you might not actually want involved in your company, or you could offer the wrong terms and get in trouble. So parade the hurdles there, but say aside from that, I want you to have a good time and a good relationship with your investors, and you should also communicate with them frequently and have a relationship with them. So how do you do that with 500 people? So part of what this looks like is taking a more realistic view and saying, yes, I could move the throttle all the way down and take in 500 investors, or I could set a realistic minimum and have people invest a little bit more money and fewer of them. And I think there's compromises there, and so it's not an all or none scenario on that level. Go ahead.
Oh, I mean, first off, venture capitals are really simple animals. I mean, it doesn't really matter what you've done before if you have a business and metrics that people believe that they can get invested in, and that's going to make a significant amount of capital. Yeah. So I would put any notion of somebody saying, if you do X, you'll never raise venture capital money, because it's completely false. Now, I do think that you need to get intelligence around a type of offering that you do, because I think there's elements of control and things like this that you want to be very careful that not only from a venture capital perspective, but your own founder's ownership and your own ability to kind of control your destination. And that's the most important thing. But no, I think that, look, venture capital is going through a transformation. It's going to change even more. And one of these things is, VCs always said, well, we would never do it if it was like that. It's completely not true. So build your business, get smart around the control and the ownership, and protective covenants, but take any amount of money you want from crowdfunding, and if you build your business the right way, the VCs will be there.
Okay, are there questions over here? Yes. Is there a mic over here? Oh, I'm sorry. Let's do a couple of these here. If we have time, we'll do it. Otherwise, these will be the last two, and we'll have to talk afterwards.
Hi, good morning. My name is Kendrick Jackson. I am with In the Capital. We're a media site covering entrepreneurship technology within the greater capital region. My question is focused on proof of concepts that have already shown to work well in other regions, specifically Silicon Valley, where you go back to the original investment from the government to some of the earlier PC firms, semiconductor firms. And then you also have the fact of Stanford as well. So you have this public-private partnership that's working out where you have the tech transfer from the university going to create companies, those companies making money from patents and using that money to give back to the endowment. How do you incentivize universities from around the country to be able to have this sort of mindset where you are creating entrepreneurs, whether it be in technology, but just all majors, so that they're creating entrepreneurs, they give back to the university, and then it's just this nice, beautiful cycle?
Okay, hold that question. I want to get one more question because I have an answer for you, but in any event.
Hello, Michael Burcham, Startup Tennessee. I'd like to direct it at Donna. You've been traveling the country for the last 2 years, and there's an important link between the current businesses in a community and what the startup community is trying to do for success. Could you speak to that a little bit more so that we all get that message really clearly?
Sure. Yeah, so over the last 2 years, I've literally visited almost every state in the country. And I can say across the board, I have yet to visit a place that doesn't have the potential to be an amazing place for startups. But there are a couple of ingredients that I find are amplifying success. So density is one of the biggest things that I would say is critical. The fact that the communities that are succeeding, they figured out a way to transcend geography and bring their startups together into, whether it's a hub, whether it's a 5 by 10 block radius, it's resonating out from a single space. But density is the key. The fact that you can come together and you know if you were dropped into that community from another city, oh, I go hang out at X if I want to get a feel for what's going on in the community. A lot of communities don't have that, especially the metropolitan sprawling areas where the startup activity might be spread across an 80-mile radius. It's very hard to get a feel for the community. But one of the things that I've seen can really jumpstart what happens in the community is the relationship in the ecosystem between the players. So the corporate citizens within the community, it's fascinating to me that we actually describe the startup ecosystem as a separate thing from the corporations. We're all part of the same ecosystem. We're just in different stages of our growth. But yet we talk about the corporations coming into the ecosystem as if they were coming to a different city and a whole different sort of part of the market. The reality is the corporate citizens in the community play a hugely valuable role in jumpstarting these startups' growth. And it's not just come and sponsor the conference, put your logo up on our signage, give us $3,000 so we can pay for the keg at the event. It's literally open your space. If you have excess space in your offices that could be used to incubate startups. You have people on your staff who understand the industry that you live in. Guess what? There's a whole ecosystem of startups outside your front doors that want to start something innovative in your community around your industry. Bring them in to help you figure out how to tackle your big challenges. Challenge them with ideas around what you need help with and let them go innovate because they'll come back with things that will be mind-boggling for you. Invest physically. Let your staff participate in startup weekends. Heck, have a startup weekend inside your corporation to get your employees thinking more like what it means to work in a startup. But the idea that it's up to either the government to create ecosystems or just the entrepreneurs to create ecosystems is a fallacy. It's up to all of us. So the only way that these places become stronger is if we all sort of get out of our lanes and come together and figure out what can we do collectively so that the sum of what we're all doing adds up to more than just our individual parts. And the corporate citizens I've seen stepping up across the country, where they're stepping up, they're doing incredible things, and they themselves are surprised at what they're finding in their own backyard. So, kudos to many of you in the room who are doing this already, but I would say it's one of the things that you can do to really jumpstart your community most aggressively.
Okay, so I want to, okay, terrific. So I want to conclude with the answer to your question about how do we get universities to do a better job of jump-starting new companies. So I hate to give a commercial, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. Buy my book, all right? The book is called Better Capitalism. I'm a co-author of it, and by Yale Press. And read chapter 5. It's an entire chapter about this. It grows out of a lot of work that I did with Lisa Mitchell, who is currently right over here, a vice president at Kauffman. And Lisa and I wrote for a number of years. You can also see on the Kauffman website this, and here's the pitch. All right? So universities basically have the intellectual property in the innovations that are developed by their faculty. The typical contract of a faculty member requires that the innovation has to be reported to a central office in the university known as the Technology Licensing Office. Originally, these TLOs were clearinghouses. They facilitated innovation. In my view, I think in Lisa's view, I'm speaking for her but, and implicating her, we think that TLOs have migrated from facilitators to stopping innovation or to slowing it down. Because if you have to go through a central office, it means you have to be cleared, you have to be wait in line for somebody to pay attention to you, et cetera, et cetera. Why can't we go to a system of free agency, just like we have in sports, where faculty members can go out and use any agent they want, and then in their contract with the university, they are required to devote a certain share of their profits back to the university. But there is no economic reason why universities should have a monopoly on licensing. None. Zero, full stop. And in the Startup Act of 2.0, when we had Senator Moran up here talking, there's a provision in that Startup Act that would incentivize universities to get away from this monopoly model by essentially giving them more money when they have grants. If it were up to me, I'd go further. I would say no federal grant money at all from the federal government unless you abandon the current model of monopoly licensing and go to free agency. So I'm glad he gave me a chance to give this sermon. Maybe sometime in my lifetime I will see this come to fruition, but actually I think we've tested your patience. I want you to give a round of applause for all of our panelists. It was a terrific panel. And just to close, for any of you reporters here, there was news here made today, all right, by our speakers and also by our panelists. And the news is that there is a lot of entrepreneurship going on around America, and it's not being shown on the front headlines of newspapers. And we see it in the room, we see it in the speakers, and let's go America. Thanks. Bye.